Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into some selections you've sent us from Noam Chomsky's Aspects of the Theory of Syntax.
Oh, excellent.
We're going to be exploring the structure of language itself.
Yeah.
But before we get too far, I have to ask,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever wondered if there's some kind of universal blueprint underlying all languages?
Well, it's a question that has fascinated linguists for centuries, and it's one that Chomsky addresses head-on with this concept of universal grammar.
Okay.
He builds on the work of an 18th century French grammarian, Du Marsay,
Right.
who distinguished between universal grammar,
Okay.
the aspects of language shared by all languages,
Got it.
and particular grammar, the rules specific to individual languages.
So universal grammar is like the framework.
Yeah.
And particular grammar fills in the details.
That's a great way to think about it.
Kind of like having a basic house plan that you can customize with the different features depending on where you're building it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Chomsky argues that understanding this universal grammar, this underlying blueprint, is key to understanding the human mind's capacity for language.
Now, this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
You also included some writings from Diderot, who had some pretty strong opinions about the French language.
He did.
He claimed French was superior because it reflected the natural order of thought, didn't he?
Diderot definitely had a bit of linguistic pride, but his idea that the order of words in a sentence directly mirrors how we think is precisely what Chomsky challenges.
Right. If word order simply reflected our thoughts,
Yeah,
wouldn't all languages have the same structure?
that's right. Yeah.
That makes sense. So how does Chomsky explain sentence structure if it's not just a direct reflection of our thoughts?
Well, he proposes the concept of deep structure,
Okay.
a hidden level of representation where the true meaning and grammatical relationships of a sentence are established.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like a magician's trick.
Okay.
The sentence you hear is the illusion, the surface structure. But beneath that surface lies the deep structure, the rabbit in the hat, where the real magic happens.
Okay, so every sentence has this hidden level of meaning. I'm starting to see why you called this a deep dive. Now, you also highlighted Chomsky's distinction between grammatical and acceptable.
Right.
What's the difference?
Okay.
Does grammatical basically mean that a sentence is technically correct, even if it sounds strange?
Exactly. Grammatical means a sentence follows the rules of the language,
Right.
the rules that are part of our innate knowledge.
Okay.
Acceptable, on the other hand, means it sounds natural and is easy to understand.
Okay.
Chomsky points out that a sentence can be grammatically correct, but still sound completely bizarre.
Like those sentences linguistics professors use as examples that make everyone's eyes glaze over?
Yes, and those bizarre-sounding sentences lead us to another concept Chomsky explores, the limitations of human memory.
I remember you mentioned something about that.
Yes.
How does memory come into play in understanding sentences?
Well, Chomsky argues that the structure of a sentence,
Yeah.
especially its complexity,
Right.
can overload our short-term memory.
Yeah.
He introduces different types of structures like nested and self-embedded structures that can make sentences incredibly difficult to process.
Can you give us an example of one of these brain-twisting sentences?
Imagine a sentence like, the dog that the cat that the bird chased bit barked. See how each clause is tucked inside the one before it?
Whoa. Yeah.
That's a classic example of self-embedding, and you can see how it quickly becomes a mental juggling act.
Wow, I can feel my brain getting tangled up already.
He's like trying to hold on to too many threads at once.
Yeah.
And this connection Chomsky makes between the structure of language and the limitations of our cognitive abilities is a key part of his work.
It's fascinating that something as seemingly simple as a sentence can reveal so much about how our minds work. Speaking of sentences with hidden depths, you highlighted a seemingly straightforward one. I had a book stolen. What makes this sentence so interesting to Chomsky?
On the surface, it seems like a simple statement: someone stole your book.
Right.
But Chomsky points out that the sentence is actually ambiguous.
Oh.
Who did the stealing?
Mm.
Was it someone else and you were the victim?
Right.
Or did you orchestrate the theft? The same surface structure can actually have multiple deep structures, each with a different interpretation.
So even a simple sentence can have these layers of meaning we may not even be aware of.
Exactly. Chomsky argues that these hidden deep structures are what determine the sentence's true meaning.
Okay.
And to get from that deep structure to the surface structure, the sentence we hear, Chomsky introduces the concept of transformations.
Right.
Think of them as the rules that govern how the deep structure, the rabbit in the hat, is transformed into the surface structure, the sentence we perceive.
Now, this is all starting to feel pretty complex, but I'm curious, you also pointed to Chomsky's discussion of formal versus substantive universals.
Right.
What exactly are these universals?
Well, remember how we talked about universal grammar being the blueprint for all languages?
Right.
Well, these universals are the specific elements that make up that blueprint.
Okay.
Formal universals are the abstract rules and principles that govern the structure of all languages. They're like the laws of physics that dictate how language can be organized.
And substantive universals.
Those are the specific elements that are found in all languages.
Okay.
That the basic building blocks.
Right.
An example Chomsky refers to is Jacobson's theory of distinctive features for phonology.
Okay.
These features are the basic components of sounds, like whether a sound is voiced or voiceless, nasal or not nasal.
Right.
Jacobson argued that these distinctive features are universal. Every language uses them in some way.
So formal universals are like the rules of the game.
Yes.
And substantive universals are the pieces on the board.
That's a fantastic analogy, and Chomsky's work is all about uncovering these universals,
Yeah.
both formal and substantive,
Right.
to understand what makes human language possible.
Now, all of this leads to the big question.
Right.
How do we actually acquire language?
Right.
I know there's a big debate between the empiricists and the rationalists when it comes to language acquisition.
There is.
Could you explain the difference between these two camps?
You're right. It's a fundamental debate in linguistics and cognitive science.
Yeah.
Empiricists believe that language is learned purely through experience,
Okay.
through being exposed to language. Think of it like a blank slate that gets filled in by what we hear and see.
Okay.
Rationalists, on the other hand.
Like Chomsky.
Exactly. Rationalists, like Chomsky, argue that we are born with innate mental structures,
Great.
a kind of language instinct
Okay.
that guide the process of language acquisition.
So it's not just a blank slate.
Yeah,
We come pre-wired with a blueprint that helps us make sense of language.
precisely. He argues that the sheer speed and complexity of language acquisition simply can't be explained by experience alone.
Right.
There must be something innate,
Yeah.
something in our genes
Mm-hmm.
that equips us to learn language so effortlessly.
So for Chomsky, understanding how our brains are wired for language is essential to understanding language itself.
Absolutely. Now, remember how we talked about deep structure being this hidden level of meaning?
Right.
Well, Chomsky argues that the deep structure also reveals the underlying grammatical relationships in a sentence.
Okay.
The subject, the object, the verb, and how they're all connected.
So the deep structure isn't just about meaning.
Uh-huh.
It's also the grammatical backbone of the sentence.
Exactly. And what's really neat is that Chomsky shows how these transformations we talked about earlier can sometimes obscure those relationships in the surface structure.
Right.
The sentence we actually hear, it's like a magician's sleight of hand.
Right.
The deep structure is the rabbit in the hat, and the transformations are the magician's movements, making the rabbit disappear and leaving us with the final illusion.
I'm starting to get a sense of how complex this all is. You also mentioned something about syntactic features.
Yeah.
What are those?
Think of them like labels we attach to words and phrases to categorize them and show how they can be combined.
Okay.
For example, a noun like dog might have the feature plus animate, meaning it refers to a living being,
Right.
or a verb like frighten might have features that specify what kind of subject and object it can take.
Mm-hmm.
It can frighten a child, but it can't frighten sincerity because sincerity isn't something that can experience fear.
So these syntactic features are like instructions for how to build grammatically correct sentences.
That's a great way to put it. They're part of our innate knowledge of language, and they guide us in how we put sentences together.
This is all starting to make language sound very rule-based, almost mathematical.
You're picking up on something important. Chomsky is trying to formalize our understanding of language.
Right.
To create a system of rules that can explain its incredible complexity and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And this brings us to another important piece of the puzzle, the lexicon.
Isn't the lexicon just a fancy word for dictionary?
Well, it's more than just a list of words and their definitions.
Right. Okay.
Chomsky argues that the lexicon, or our mental dictionary, also contains a wealth of syntactic information about each word.
Right.
Its grammatical category, its syntactic features, and the types of structures it could appear in.
So the lexicon is like a vast database in our minds, with each word having its own file filled with linguistic information.
That's a great way to visualize it.
This is all really starting to come together. We have the deep structure, the lexicon, the syntactic features, and then those transformations that work behind the scenes to create the sentences we speak and hear.
Right.
But I'm curious, how do those transformations actually work?
Well, remember how we talked about the passive voice earlier?
Yeah.
That's a classic example of a transformation at work.
Okay.
It takes a sentence like, the dog chased the cat, and transforms it into, the cat was chased by the dog.
So the transformation changes the word order and adds some extra words.
Exactly. And Chomsky explains how these transformations can move, add, or even delete elements in a sentence to create the surface structure we hear. He even uses them to explain more complex structures, like relative clauses and comparisons.
This is making me realize how much goes on beneath the surface of language. It's incredible.
It is.
But you also mentioned that sometimes
Yeah.
even just changing the word order can cause problems.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
It all comes down to ambiguity.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about how sentences can have multiple interpretations?
Right.
Well,
Right.
Chomsky talks about how stylistic inversion, which is basically changing word order for stylistic effect,
Right.
can sometimes create ambiguity,
Okay.
for example.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, I have to ask, if language is so rule-based and structured, what about meaning? Where does that fit in?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And even Chomsky admits that the semantic component of grammar,
Right.
the part that deals with meaning,
Yeah.
is still very much a work in progress.
Okay.
He provides a framework for thinking about meaning, but doesn't claim to have all the answers.
Right.
But he does raise some intriguing ideas about the relationship between meaning and syntax,
Okay.
like those selectional restrictions we discussed earlier.
Right. Those rules that prevent us from saying things like, John frightened sincerity.
Exactly. Those restrictions are based on the meaning of words, on what makes sense semantically.
Right.
You can't frighten sincerity because sincerity isn't a living thing that can experience fear.
Right.
Chomsky even suggests that these selectional restrictions might actually belong to the semantic component of grammar, not the syntactic one.
So there's this ongoing conversation about where these rules of meaning fit into the bigger picture of language.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It highlights just how intertwined syntax and semantics really are.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to draw a clear boundary between the structure of language and the meaning it conveys.
Right.
And speaking of how our brains process meaning,
Yeah.
have you ever noticed that what a sentence says and what it means can be two different things?
You mean like when someone asks, can you pass the salt? They're not really asking about my physical ability to pass the salt.
Right.
They're making a request.
Precisely.
Yeah.
There's the literal meaning of the sentence.
Right.
And then there's the implied meaning. And Chomsky argues that understanding this distinction is crucial for a complete theory of language.
This is all incredibly fascinating.
It is.
We've talked about so much already, but I know we've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Before we move on, are there any key insights you think our listeners should take away from this discussion so far?
Well, one of the most important takeaways is that language is much more complex than we often realize.
Yeah.
It's not just a simple tool for communication. It's a window into the structure of the human mind.
Okay.
By studying language, we can learn about how our brains work.
Right.
Chomsky's work has shown that we're born with an innate capacity for language, a kind of language instinct, which guides the process of language acquisition.
That's amazing. It means we're all born with the potential to learn any language.
That's right.
Wow.
And it emphasizes the incredible power and flexibility of the human mind.
So what does this all mean for us as language users? How does understanding Chomsky's work change the way we think about language in our everyday lives?
It encourages us to pay closer attention to the language we use
Right.
and the language we hear,
Okay.
to think about the hidden structures, the deep meanings, and the universal principles that Chomsky has revealed.
You're right. It's almost like learning a secret code.
Yeah.
Now, earlier you mentioned that Chomsky challenges the traditional item and arrangement approach to grammar.
I did.
Can you explain what he means by that?
Well, Chomsky argues that traditional grammar, which focuses on surface features and classifications,
Okay.
doesn't fully capture the true generative power of language.
Right.
He uses the term generative to emphasize that language isn't just a fixed set of sentences we've memorized. Instead, it's a system of rules that allows us to create and understand an infinite number of new sentences.
So rather than just describing language, Chomsky wants to explain the underlying mechanisms that allow us to produce and comprehend it.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's like the difference between describing a car and understanding how the engine works.
That's a great analogy.
Mm.
Now, I know we spent a lot of time on transformations and deep structure,
Yes.
but you also highlighted Chomsky's discussion of redundancy rules.
Right.
Can you explain what those are?
Well, think of them as shortcuts in language
Okay.
that help us avoid unnecessary repetition.
Mm-hmm.
They capture predictable patterns,
Right.
both in sounds and syntax,
Yeah.
which makes grammatical descriptions more efficient.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. In English, there's a rule that says plural nouns usually end in S.
Right.
We don't need to specify this for every single noun.
Yeah.
Because the rule captures the general pattern.
So redundancy rules help to streamline the grammar by highlighting these predictable patterns.
Exactly.
Now, earlier we touched on the idea that sentences can have multiple interpretations.
Yeah.
But I'm curious,
So?
can you give us some more examples of ambiguity in language?
Of course.
Okay.
Let's take the sentence, I saw the man with the telescope.
Okay.
Now, who has the telescope in this sentence? Is it the speaker observing the man through a telescope,
Right.
or is the speaker observing a man who is holding a telescope?
Right.
The sentence can be interpreted in two completely different ways.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. It's amazing how a simple sentence can have such different meanings depending on how we interpret it.
And that ambiguity is a key part of what makes language so fascinating and complex.
Okay, before we move on, there's one more thing I have to ask.
Okay.
You mentioned something about Chomsky's views on coordination and branching structures.
I did.
Can you give us a quick rundown of what that's all about?
Well, this gets a bit technical, but it's an interesting example of how Chomsky advocates for simplicity in grammatical descriptions.
Right.
When it comes to phrases like John, Mary, and their two children,
Mm-hmm.
Chomsky sees them as multiple branching structures,
Okay.
where each element in the list is equal important
Right.
without any subgroupings.
So it's like a flat organizational chart
Oh, yeah.
with everyone reporting directly to the CEO.
Exactly.
No middle management.
And this reflects Chomsky's overall approach to grammar. Keep it elegant, keep it simple.
I like that philosophy.
It's a good one.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, but I still have so many questions. For example, Chomsky's ideas have been so influential. How have they changed the field of linguistics?
Well, for one, Chomsky's work has really highlighted the importance of studying language acquisition,
Okay.
how children develop this incredible ability to understand and produce language. And his emphasis on the innate biological basis of language has led to a whole new field of research called biolinguistics, which explores the relationship between language and the brain.
That's incredible. So Chomsky's work has opened up all sorts of new avenues of inquiry in linguistics.
He has.
But his ideas haven't been without their critics, have they?
Of course not.
Right.
No theory, however groundbreaking, is immune to critique.
Yeah.
For example, some linguists argue that Chomsky focuses too much on the universal aspects of language
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't pay enough attention to the diversity of languages across cultures.
That's a valid point.
It is.
It's important to remember that language is both universal and culturally specific.
Exactly. And the debate between those who emphasize the universal aspects of language and those who emphasize the particular aspects continues to this day.
This has been an incredible deep dive already.
It has been.
I feel like we've just begun to explore the depths of Chomsky's work.
There's always more to explore.
But before we continue, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What stood out to you?
well-
Was it the idea of deep structure, the notion of universal grammar, or maybe those selectional restrictions that prevent us from saying nonsensical things?
For me, what's most fascinating is the idea that by studying language, we're not just studying a system of communication.
Yeah.
We're studying the human mind itself.
Okay.
Language is a tool that allows us to express our thoughts and ideas.
Rough.
It's also a window into how we think and how we perceive the world.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's what makes Chomsky's work so captivating.
It is.
He's not just a linguist, he's a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, and a revolutionary thinker who has challenged us to see language in a whole new light.
And what's even more inspiring is that he continues to ask those big questions about the nature of language and the human mind, even after decades of research.
Wow.
That's the kind of intellectual curiosity we should all strive for.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, I know we still have a lot more to discuss about Chomsky's work, but I think it's time for a short break.
Okay.
We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive.
Sounds good. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how Chomsky's work has opened up new avenues of research in linguistics.
Right.
And one area where his ideas have been particularly influential is in the study of language and thought.
Okay.
Have you ever considered that the language we speak might actually shape the way we think?
I've heard that idea before, but I've always been a bit skeptical.
Uh-huh.
It seems like our thoughts come first,
Right.
and language is just a way to express them.
Yeah.
How could the language we speak actually influence our thoughts?
Well, it's a fascinating question. And Chomsky argues that language doesn't just reflect thought.
Okay.
It actively shapes it. Think of it like wearing different pairs of glasses.
Okay.
Each language has its own way of categorizing and organizing experience.
Right.
And that can have a real impact on how we think about everything from space and time
Mm-hmm.
to emotions and relationships.
So different languages might lead people to see the world in different ways.
Absolutely.
Could you give me an example of how that might work?
Let's take the example of color terms.
Okay.
Some languages have very few basic color terms, while others have many.
Right.
For example, the Himba people of Namibia have only 5 basic color terms,
Wow.
while English has 11.
Okay.
Research has shown that this difference in color terminology can actually affect how people perceive and categorize colors.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So the language we speak can actually change the way we see the world around us.
Yeah. It's pretty mind-blowing.
I'm starting to understand why this idea has been so controversial.
It's a big one.
Now, earlier we were talking about transformations and how they can affect the processing of sentences.
Right.
I remember you mentioned Jung's theory of sentence production and perception.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what that theory is all about?
Sure.
And how it relates to memory constraints?
Of course. Jung argued that both speakers and listeners produce and process sentences in a kind of top-down fashion,
Okay.
meaning they first determine the major structures of the sentence,
Right.
then the substructures, and finally the individual words. It's like building a house. You start with the foundation and work your way up to the roof.
That makes sense. But where does memory come into play?
Well, Jung believed that this process is constrained by our limited short-term memory capacity.
Right.
The more complex the sentence,
Yeah.
the harder it is to hold all the pieces in mind at once.
Okay.
And this is where Chomsky's work on transformations comes in.
Okay, remind me again how transformations work.
Transformations are the rules that allow us to manipulate the deep structure of a sentence
Right.
to create the surface structure we hear.
Mm-hmm.
And Chomsky acknowledges that certain transformations can actually make sentences easier to process
Okay.
by reducing the amount of information we need to hold in our short-term memory.
So transformations aren't just about changing the grammatical form of a sentence.
Right.
They can also make sentences more cognitively accessible.
Exactly.
Could you give us an example of that?
Certainly. Remember that tongue twister sentence we talked about earlier?
The dog one.
The dog that the cat that the bird chased bit barked.
Yeah.
Well, imagine if we transformed that sentence into the passive voice. The bark was made by the dog that was bitten by the cat that was chased by the bird.
That's still a mouthful.
It is.
But I do think it's a bit easier to follow than the original version.
That's because the passive voice helps to break the sentence down into smaller chunks,
Okay.
reducing the load on our memory.
So transformations can actually help us to understand complex sentences. That's fascinating.
It really highlights the interplay between language, our cognitive abilities, and the structure of grammar.
Speaking of Chomsky's focus on the structure of grammar,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that he advocates for a rationalist approach to linguistics.
All right.
Can you explain what that means and
Sure,
how it
sure.
contrasts with the more traditional empiricist view?
You're right. Chomsky is definitely a champion of the rationalist perspective.
Okay.
In the context of language, rationalism emphasizes the role of innate mental structures
Mm-hmm.
in our capacity for language. It argues that we're not just blank slates waiting to be filled by experience,
Yeah.
but rather we come pre-wired with a blueprint for language,
Okay.
a kind of language instinct, as Steven Pinker famously called it.
So we're born with a predisposition for language, and that shapes how we learn and use it.
That's the idea.
What about the empiricist view?
Okay.
How does that differ?
Well, empiricism, on the other hand, emphasizes the role of experience in language learning.
Okay.
It argues that we acquire language primarily through exposure to linguistic input,
Right.
through hearing and imitating the language around us. It's the nurture side of the nature versus nurture debate.
So Chomsky's rationalist approach is all about the nature side of the equation.
Precisely. Chomsky believes that the complexity and speed of language acquisition can't be explained by experience alone.
Right.
There has to be something more, something innate,
Okay.
that allows children to master language so quickly and effortlessly.
It's interesting to think about how these two perspectives offer such different explanations for how we acquire language.
Yeah.
Now, earlier we were talking about the lexicon and how it contains not just words, but also their syntactic properties.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a bit? What kind of information is actually stored in our mental lexicon?
Think of it like this. Each word in our mental lexicon is like a file folder
Okay.
containing a wealth of information.
Right.
We have the word itself, of course, but we also have information about its grammatical category.
Yeah.
Is it a noun, a verb, an adjective?
Right.
Then we have information about its syntactic features, those labels we talked about earlier that tell us how the word can be combined with other words.
Right.
And we also have information about its argument structure,
Okay.
how many and what kind of arguments the word requires.
So for a verb like give, the lexicon would specify that it typically requires 3 arguments.
Yeah.
A giver, a recipient, and something that is given.
Exactly. And all of this information is crucial for constructing grammatically well-formed sentences.
It's amazing to think about how much information our brains are storing and processing every time we use language.
There's a lot.
Now, you also highlighted a passage where Chomsky discusses the limitations of current linguistic theory
Right.
when it comes to explaining semantic interpretation,
Wow.
how we derive meaning from language. Why is meaning so challenging to pin down?
It's one of the most complex and elusive aspects of language. Chomsky acknowledges that we still have a long way to go in fully understanding how we extract meaning from words and sentences.
Yeah.
Part of the challenge is that meaning is not always straightforward.
Right.
It can be context-dependent, cultural influenced, and even subjective.
So a word can have different meanings depending on the situation,
Yeah.
the culture, and even the individual using it.
Exactly, and that makes it incredibly difficult to create a comprehensive theory of meaning that can account for all of these variations.
This is making me think about the limitations of language itself.
Okay, can language ever truly capture the full complexity of our thoughts and experiences?
That's a profound question, and one that philosophers have grappled with for centuries.
Right.
It's true that language has its limits,
Yeah.
and there are always nuances of thought and feeling that are difficult to express in words.
Right.
But at the same time, language is an incredibly powerful tool, capable of conveying a vast range of ideas, emotions, and experiences.
It's a beautiful and frustrating paradox.
Indeed. Now, I know we've touched on a lot of complex topics today.
We have.
Is there anything in particular that stands out to you as especially intriguing or thought-provoking?
I think for me, the idea that language can actually shape our thoughts is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if learning a new language might actually change the way I see the world.
That's a fantastic insight, and it's something that research in bilingualism is actively exploring.
Wow.
There's growing evidence that speaking multiple languages can have a real impact on cognitive flexibility, creativity, and even problem-solving skills. This is all so fascinating. I'm already starting to look at language in a whole new light.
That's what we aim for here on the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
To inspire curiosity and to show you the incredible depth and richness of the world around us.
And we're not done yet. We still have much more to explore in the world of Chomsky and his groundbreaking ideas about language.
We do.
We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I don't know about you, but I'm still reeling from all the mind-blowing concepts we've explored so far. We've talked about everything from deep structure to transformations to the idea that language might actually shape our thoughts.
Yeah, it's quite a journey, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a lot to take in, but that's the beauty of a deep dive.
Right.
It allows us to really explore the complexities of a topic and to challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up our exploration of Chomsky's work,
Okay.
there's one more passage I wanted to touch on.
Yeah.
It's the section where Chomsky analyzes those coordinated phrases like John, Mary, and their 2 children. Can you refresh our memory on what Chomsky has to say about these types of constructions?
Of course. This is where Chomsky's emphasis on simplicity and elegance in grammatical descriptions really shines through.
Right.
He argues for the most straightforward interpretation of coordinated phrases,
Okay.
seeing them as multiple branching structures.
Right.
Essentially, he views each element in the list as equally important,
Okay.
without any hierarchical subgroupings.
So instead of trying to force those phrases into a hierarchical structure,
Yeah.
he sees them as all on the same level.
Exactly.
Kind of like a flat organizational chart where everyone reports directly to the CEO, no middle management needed.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it reflects Chomsky's overall approach to grammar. Don't add unnecessary complexity unless there's strong evidence to support it.
I like that. Keep it simple, keep it elegant.
Yeah, it's a good guiding principle, I think.
I think so too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know we've only scratched the surface of Chomsky's vast and influential body of work, but I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the complexity and power of language.
I think that's one of the great things about diving into Chomsky.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how much more there is to language than we often realize.
You're right.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Language is so much more than just a tool for communication. It's a window into the human mind, a reflection of our cognitive abilities, and a testament to the creative potential of our species.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other secrets are hidden within the structure of language.
Yeah.
What else can we learn about ourselves and the human mind by delving deeper into the realms of syntax and semantics?
Those are great questions. And they're precisely the kinds of questions that Chomsky himself continues to grapple with, even after decades of groundbreaking research.
Right.
What's so inspiring about him is that he never stops asking those questions. Never stops pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
And that's the spirit we try to embody here on The Deep Dive.
Absolutely.
We want to encourage our listeners to be curious,
Right.
to challenge assumptions,
Yeah.
and to embrace the joy of intellectual exploration.
So as you go about your day, pay attention to the language you use and the language you hear.
Right.
Think about those hidden structures, those deep meanings, and those universal principles that Chomsky has revealed.
Yeah.
You might be surprised by what you discover.
It's a whole new way of looking at the world, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, that's a great challenge for our listeners. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the mind of Noam Chomsky.
It was a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, so stay tuned.